North America folklore contains many captivating characters, each with their own flavor unique to the area they were popular in. From the northern reaches, we encounter the larger-than-life legends of the mighty lumberjack Paul Bunyan and Babe, his colossal blue ox. Venture into the mysterious hills of West Virginia, and you'll encounter the enigmatic Mothman, a winged humanoid whose presence foretells impending misfortune. In the southwest, we meet Pecos Bill, a cowboy whose upbringing by coyotes shaped his extraordinary abilities and wild adventures. And in the heartland of the Midwest, a figure named Johnny Appleseed emerges, sowing apple seeds while donning a humble tin pot upon his head. Among these legends, only one stands as a real person whose actions have become revered folklore. Join us on this remarkable journey through time as we delve into the life and times of John Chapman, known far and wide as Johnny Appleseed. In this moment in history, we deconstruct the legend and myth to bring to you this larger-than-life man. John Chapman was born in 1774 in Massachusetts. Much of his early years are lost to history, but he reappears in the early 1800s in western Pennsylvania as an apprentice orchardist. It is during this time that he acquired the skills and passion for growing apple trees. Legends often depict Chapman as a shabbily dressed man, sometimes wearing coffee sacks for clothing and wandering about barefoot with a tin pot atop his head. It's hard to believe, but the legends are mostly correct. Author Rosella Rice, who personally met Chapman, wrote this about him in the 1863 History of Ashland County, Ohio.
His personal appearance was as singular as his character. He was a small, chunked man, quick and restless in his motions and conversation. His beard, though not long, was unshaven, and his hair was long and dark, and his eye black and sparkling. He lived the roughest life, and often slept in the woods. His clothing was mostly old, being generally given to him in exchange for apple trees. He went barefooted and often traveled miles through the snow in that way.
Rice went on to describe his manner of speech.
His voice rose denunciatory and thrilling, strong and loud as the roar of wind and waves, then soft and soothing as the balmy airs that quivered the morning glory leaves about his gray beard. His was a strange eloquence at times, and he was undoubtedly a man of genius.
Many of Chapman's eccentricities were likely influenced by the new church, of which he was a devout member. The first time Chapman was reported in a publication was in a 1817 New Church Bulletin published in Manchester, England, which described Chapman as a missionary who travelled around the West planting apple trees and passing out books of the new church. Once, while Chapman attended a sermon from an itinerant missionary in Mansfield, Ohio, the preacher admonished the gathered farmers for their extravagance, apparently from wearing calico and drinking imported tea. The preacher asked,
"Where now is there a man who, like the primitive Christians, is traveling to heaven barefooted and clad in coarse raiment?"
John Chapman reportedly stepped forward, placed his bare foot upon the stump the minister stood upon, and proclaimed,
"Here's your primitive Christian."
Chapman's religious beliefs formed his relationship with plants and animals. No clearer is this demonstrated than by the following excerpt from Henry Howe's 3-volume Historical Collections of Ohio.
One cool autumnal night, while lying by his campfire in the woods, he observed that the mosquitoes flew in the blaze and were burned. Johnny, who wore on his head a tin utensil which answered both as a cap and a mush pot, filled it with water and quenched the fire, and afterwards remarked,
"God forbid that I should build a fire for my comfort that should be the means of destroying any of his creatures."
As Chapman migrated westward, legends often portray him as a carefree wanderer who scattered apple seeds throughout the countryside. However, Chapman did not plant them willy-nilly everywhere he went. Instead, he started young apple trees in nurseries. He built fences around the young trees to protect them from livestock and wildlife, and would leave them under the care of neighbours while he moved on to the next location. In this manner, he accumulated thousands of acres of land. He wasn't planting these apple trees for fun, but for profit, for he was actually a successful businessman. The nurseries of apple trees he grew were sold to an eager market. In the early 1800s, America was expanding westward into what was then called the Northwest Territory. These lands lay north of the Ohio and east of the Mississippi rivers and south of the Great Lakes. This area would soon make up the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Speculators and private companies bought up huge tracts of land in the Northwest Territories. They needed to entice settlers to move west into these wild lands and develop them. The Ohio Company of Associates made a deal with prospective settlers. Anyone willing to establish a homestead in the Ohio frontier would be given 100 acres of land. The only requirement was that they had to plant 50 apple and 20 peach trees within 3 years. This is the market that Chapman tapped into. As he moved westward, he stayed one step ahead of the incoming settlers, growing apple trees in nurseries. When the settlers arrived, they found a supply of apple trees ready for planting, saving them time and effort. The sales of the trees allowed Chapman to move on and invest in more land for nurseries. Another detail often distorted in the Johnny Appleseed legend is the type of apples he grew. The plump, red and tasty apples that we find in the grocery store today are grown via grafting, which is a horticulture technique of joining two different plants so as to continue their growth together. Tasty apple branches are thus grafted onto hardy rootstock to withstand the harsh Midwestern winters, otherwise the trees would perish. However, due to religious reasons, Chapman was strongly against grafting. He felt that the process caused the tree to suffer. Therefore, he grew wild apple trees from seeds, which he often got for free from cider mills. This type of apple is very bitter and essentially inedible. The main use for such a fruit was the making of hard cider, varying from 3 to 7% alcohol. In those early settler days, apples were less likely to be eaten than to be made into hard cider. In rural areas, cider replaced wine, beer, and even coffee and tea. In many cases, cider was safer to drink than potentially contaminated water. Some historians believe the harsh conditions of the frontier life drove many people to pass their lives in an alcoholic haze. These settlers reportedly drank 10.5 ounces of hard cider a day, and it was as common to have on the dinner table as was meat and bread. After spending 50 years moving about the Northwest Territories planting his apple trees, Chapman made his last trip back to Ohio in 1842. There he retired with his half-brother Nathaniel. On March 18, 1845, he was visiting a friend in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and contracted pneumonia. It was the first time he was ever sick, and it took his life. The Goshen Democrat newspaper published his death notice as,
In Fort Wayne, on Tuesday 18th, John Chapman, commonly known by the name of Johnny Appleseed, about 70 years of age. Many of our citizens will remember this eccentric individual as he sauntered through town eating his dry rusk and cold meat and freely conversing on the mysteries of his religious faith. He was a devoted follower of Emanuel Swedenborg, and notwithstanding his apparent poverty, was reputed to be in good circumstances.
The Fort Wayne Sentinel wrote in his obituary,
The deceased was well known through this region by his eccentricity and the strange garb he usually wore. He followed the occupation of a nurseryman and has been a regular visitor here upwards of 10 years. He is supposed to have considerable property, yet denied himself almost the common necessities of life, not so much perhaps for avarice as from his peculiar notions on religious subjects.
Chapman left an estate of 1,200 acres of nurseries to his sister, including some 15,000 trees. Unfortunately, a financial panic in 1837 took a toll on the estate, and after his death, taxes and litigation ate deeply into the rest. Chapman's legacy of apple trees did not last much longer than he. During Prohibition, most sour apple trees used to make alcohol were chopped down by FBI agents. Indirectly, we may have John Chapman to thank for the variety of apples we have in the grocery stores today. Author Michael Pollan argues that Chapman's tireless efforts to propagate apples via seeds lent itself to creating the great American apple. As apple production shifted from cider making to eating, Chapman's vast plantings of cider apple seeds became some wonderful American cultivars of the 19th century. Although the fruits of Chapman's labours are no longer available, he left behind a lasting legacy of legends and folklore, most of which are fairly accurate. His environmental stewardship, perseverance, generosity, and simplicity left a timeless mark on our culture. Thank you for watching this moment in history. If you liked this episode, please like and subscribe.